Hey there, fellow knowledge seekers. Before we get started today, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss any of our deep dives. Okay, let's get into it. Today we're diving deep into a topic that's, well, it's kind of a cornerstone of economics.
It's one that's particularly relevant, I think, for anyone who's aspiring to take the UPSC exams, or maybe you're just a student who's trying to get a better grasp on the financial world.
Yeah, anyone really who wants to be financially literate. We're talking about the balance of payments.
Yes, the balance of payments. Or, as it's more commonly known, the BOP.
BOP, okay. Now, I know this can sound a little bit dry and maybe even a little bit intimidating, but trust me when I say this is something that's super important to understand.
I think once you understand the balance of payments, you unlock this whole new understanding of how countries interact financially.
Exactly. So let's ditch the jargon for a second and think about it this way.
Yeah.
Imagine a country is like a big bustling shop.
Right.
Money's constantly flowing in and out. People are buying things. The shop owner is investing in new equipment.
Maybe even sending money abroad to family or something like that.
Yeah, exactly, like remittances and stuff.
Exactly.
So the balance of payments, or BOP, is like having this super meticulous accountant who is keeping track of every rupee, every dollar,
Yeah.
every euro that comes in or goes out of that shop.
Yes, it's a record of all the financial transactions between one country and all the other countries in the world.
So it's not just about buying and selling goods, right?
No, it's every financial interaction that a country has
Wow, okay.
with the outside world. So think about things like tourism. Tourists coming into a country and spending their money, that's an inflow.
Right.
Or you have companies in India that are investing in businesses overseas.
Yeah.
That would be an outflow.
Yeah.
It also includes things like foreign aid or remittances that we were talking about before.
Okay, so it's a much broader picture
Yeah.
than just simply trade.
Much broader. Yeah.
Now, I remember from, my econ classes back in the day that the BOP is divided into a few key components.
Absolutely. Think of it like a big, spreadsheet that your accountant loves to use with multiple tabs.
Yeah.
We have the current account, which basically looks at the day-to-day earnings of our shop. So it's primarily tracking exports and imports of goods and services.
Okay.
And then you have the capital account, which deals with the capital flows. So things like loans, investments, changes in foreign exchange reserves, all of that falls under the capital account.
Gotcha. And then, of course, we have the financial account, right?
The financial account?
Which is all about long-term investment. So, like,
Yeah.
if an Indian company buys stock in a foreign company, or maybe if we're attracting foreign investment into our own businesses here in India.
Yeah, exactly. So that would be a financial account. Those are our three main players in this whole balance of payments, saga.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting thing here is that ideally all of these inflows and outflows should balance each other out.
Okay, so everything's hunky-dory when the books are balanced.
When the books are balanced, everything is great, but that rarely happens.
Yeah, I was about to say, I have a feeling it's not always that neat and tidy in the real world.
Very rarely in the real world do you find perfect balance. There are almost always surpluses and deficits, and that's where things get really interesting.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit further then.
Yeah.
First off, let's define exactly what we mean by the balance of payments. It's more than just a simple accounting sheet, right?
It is. It's a very detailed record of every financial transaction between a country and everybody else in the world
Okay.
over a specific period of time. So usually we're looking at it over a year. And the BOP-ish, it helps us understand the economic relationship that one country has with the rest of the world.
And you mentioned earlier that these transactions are kind of categorized, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So there are two major categories: factored payments and transfer payments. When we talk about factored payments, we're talking about a situation where there's some sort of quid pro quo.
Okay.
So basically, you're getting something in return for your money.
Like a two-way street.
Exactly like a
Yeah.
two-way street. There's an exchange of value happening. So for example, if you are paying for imported goods,
Okay.
or let's say you're receiving money because your company is exporting some kind of software service,
Right.
that's a factored payment.
Okay.
The second category is transfer payments, and this is where you have a one-way transaction. So think about remittances, people working abroad, sending money back home to their families.
Right.
Or foreign aid that's given to a country maybe in the aftermath of a natural disaster.
Okay, so factored payments are kind of like buying and selling.
Yeah.
And transfer payments are more like giving and receiving.
Perfect. You got it. Now going back to this perfect scenario where the BOP is completely balanced.
Right.
In practice, it almost never happens. There are almost always going to be surpluses or deficits.
So what does that actually mean for a country? Is a surplus always a good thing? Is a deficit always a bad thing?
Well, it's not quite as simple as that. It really depends on the context. You have to look at the underlying factors that are driving these imbalances. But that's a conversation that we should probably save for our next segment.
Ooh, a cliffhanger. All right, listeners, we've laid the groundwork for understanding the balance of payments. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2, where we'll dive deeper into the complexities of surpluses and deficits and explore how this all plays out in the real world.
Welcome back to the deep dive. As promised, we're going to be talking about imbalances in the balance of payments.
Yeah, we left off on that note of suspense surpluses and deficits.
It can be pretty dramatic, actually.
It does sound like we're about to unravel some sort of financial thriller.
Especially when these imbalances become very large or they persist for, a long time.
Yeah.
But let's start with the concept of a surplus.
Okay, so that basically means that more money is flowing into a country than flowing outright. So like our shop is making a profit.
Exactly.
Sounds like a good thing.
Yeah, on the surface, it does seem pretty positive. A surplus, it could indicate that a country is very competitive in the global market. Maybe they're exporting way more than they're importing.
Right.
Or it could mean that they're attracting a lot of foreign investment.
Okay, so why wouldn't a surplus always be a good thing then? What's the catch?
Well, there are a few potential downsides. I mean, a large and persistent surplus can sometimes point to some kind of underlying economic issue.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, it might mean that a country isn't investing enough domestically.
Mm.
Or it could suggest that the economy is too reliant on exports,
Okay.
which makes them very vulnerable to fluctuations in global demand. If suddenly the rest of the world doesn't want their products.
Right. It's all about balance, isn't it? Not too hot, not too cold.
Exactly.
What about deficits then?
Yeah.
They sound a bit more worrisome, to be honest.
Yeah, a deficit basically means that more money is flowing out of the country than in.
Okay.
And this can happen for several reasons. Maybe a country is importing a lot more than it's exporting, or maybe there's a significant outflow of capital for some reason.
So it's like our shop is spending more than it's earning.
Yeah, and that's not going to be sustainable for very long.
No, definitely not.
Exactly. So a persistent deficit can raise concerns about a country's, economic stability.
Right.
It could indicate that maybe they're overdependent on imports,
Hmm.
or maybe they lack competitiveness in their export sector.
Yeah.
Sometimes excessive government spending can lead to a deficit.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how these imbalances, can have very real consequences.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that,
Yeah.
Understanding the BOP is really relevant for UPSC aspirants.
Absolutely.
Can you connect the dots for us there a little bit?
Well, it's a key topic in the UPSC economics syllabus,
Right.
but it's not just about, memorizing definitions and facts and figures.
Mhm.
It's about really understanding how a country interacts economically with the rest of the world.
Right.
UPSC examiners, they love to ask questions that require you to analyze BOP trends, to identify the causes of these imbalances
Okay.
and to think about policy measures that could be used to address the situation.
So it's more about connecting the dots and, analyzing real-world situations.
Exactly.
And applying those economic principles to kind of come up with solutions.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So it's a valuable skill, not just for, passing the exam,
Exactly.
but for anyone who wants to work in this field.
Exactly.
Great. Okay, so we've talked about surpluses and deficits in a general sense,
Yeah.
but I'm curious to know how India is doing
Yeah.
on the BOP front.
So India's BOP situation is quite interesting. It's a fascinating case study.
Yeah.
Like a lot of developing economies, India has historically had challenges with BOP deficits.
Okay.
But in recent years, there have been some positive developments, particularly in terms of narrowing the current account deficit.
That sounds encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely.
What factors have contributed to this improvement?
Well, one of the key factors has been the growth of India's services sector. We've really become a global powerhouse in IT and software development and business process outsourcing.
Right.
And these service exports, they bring in a lot of revenue, which boosts the current account.
So it's giving India a competitive edge
Absolutely.
in the global market.
Yeah. And another positive trend is the increase in remittances that are coming in from Indians working abroad.
Right.
And these remittances, they play a really crucial role in supporting families back home.
Yeah.
And they also add significantly to foreign exchange earnings.
It's good to know that those contributions are making a difference
Yeah, absolutely.
on kind of a macro level as well.
Yes.
But we need to talk about the challenges as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the persistent challenges that India faces is its dependence on oil imports.
Right.
As you know, global oil prices rise. That puts a strain on the current account.
Yeah.
It widens the deficit.
So it's a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Managing those imports and exports, attracting that foreign investment, promoting domestic growth.
It is a constant balancing act.
Yeah.
And India's BOP situation, it's constantly evolving.
Right.
And it really requires careful monitoring and proactive policy measures to make sure that, things stay stable and that growth is sustainable.
Now, before we move on, I want to highlight something that you mentioned earlier about the relevance of the BOP for everyone.
Yes.
Not just, econ students or UPSC aspirants.
Yeah.
Why should the average person care about this?
That's a great question. I think understanding the BOP helps us all make sense of the economic news
Okay.
and understand how it might impact our lives.
Right.
For example, when you hear about the rupee, strengthening or weakening against the dollar,
Right.
the BOP is at play there.
Sure.
It influences things like interest rates and inflation, even the prices of the goods and services that we buy every day.
So it's like having this decoder ring to help us understand all of the forces that are shaping the economy, both at home and globally.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So we've covered a lot in this segment. We've explored all those nuances of surpluses and deficits.
Yes.
We've talked about India's unique BOP situation.
Yes.
And we've highlighted why this topic is important for everyone.
Yeah.
But our deep dive isn't over yet. So make sure you stay tuned for part 3,
Yes.
where we'll examine some real-world examples
Yes.
and case studies that really bring the BOP to life.
Welcome back to the deep dive, listeners. We've gone through the ins and outs of the balance of payments. We've looked at surpluses, deficits, and we even zoomed in on India's economic performance on the world stage.
Yep.
But now I think it's time to make it all a bit more real.
Yeah, exactly. Real-world examples are a great way to actually see these theories in action.
Totally.
And I think they're particularly useful for our UPSC folks out there, those who are prepping for the exams.
For sure. So what kind of fascinating cases do you have for us today?
Well, let's start with a country that's been a major player in the global economy for a long time. We're talking about China.
Okay.
China has consistently run a surplus in its current account.
Right. And that's mainly because of their massive export sector.
Yeah, they're like the world's factory.
Right. Exactly. They're the world's factory. They can produce goods on such a massive scale.
Uh-huh.
And this has led to them accumulating a huge amount of foreign exchange reserves, which basically gives them a lot of financial power globally.
It's like their shop is turned into this global megastore,
Right.
raking in all the profits.
Exactly.
But as we talked about before, a large surplus isn't always a guaranteed win.
Right.
So what are some of the potential downsides for China?
Well, one concern is that holding so many reserves can actually create imbalances in the global economy.
Okay.
Some economists, they argue that this actually keeps the value of the Chinese currency artificially low, which gives their exports an unfair advantage.
Right.
And that can lead to trade tensions with other countries.
So they're kind of playing the game with a different set of rules, which causes some friction.
Exactly. It's a very complex issue with a lot of implications.
Right.
Now let's look at another economic giant, but with a very different BOP story, the United States. The U.S. has consistently had a current account deficit for decades,
Oh, wow.
mostly because they import a lot.
Yeah, it's like the U.S. shop is this haven for consumers just constantly bringing in stuff from all over the world.
Right, exactly. And this constant demand for imports means that a lot of dollars are flowing out, and that contributes to this persistent deficit. Now, a deficit can be worrying, but the U.S. has managed because the dollar is like the world's reserve currency.
Yeah, they have this special privilege in the global system.
Exactly. The demand for dollars helps them finance this deficit, but it's still a situation that needs to be managed very carefully.
Yeah, it sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is.
Now, I'm curious about an example where a BOP crisis actually had, very real consequences.
Yeah. A good case study is the Greek sovereign debt crisis that happened back in 2010.
Yeah.
Greece had been running these current account deficits for years, and that was because of excessive government spending and a lack of competitiveness in their export sector. And then the global financial crisis hit, and it just exposed all of their vulnerabilities.
Right.
Investors lost confidence, borrowing costs skyrocketed.
Like the shop was living on borrowed money for too long.
Exactly. And when it was time to pay up, the whole system collapsed.
Yeah.
Greece had to ask for a bailout from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund,
Wow.
which led to years of really tough austerity measures and economic hardship for the Greek people.
It shows that these imbalances in the BOP can have a really big impact on people's lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we need sound economic policies and responsible management.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, let's circle back to our listeners,
Yeah.
especially those who are working hard to ace those UPSC exams.
Yes, let's give them some key takeaways.
Okay, so first of all, understanding the BOP, it's not just about, memorizing a bunch of terms.
Yeah.
You have to see the connections between different economic indicators.
Yeah.
You have to understand how things like exports, imports, foreign investment, government policies, how all of those things come together to impact a country's BOP.
It's about seeing that big picture.
Exactly. Second thing is pay attention to real-world examples, case studies. Look at historical trends, compare different countries.
Yep.
Try to understand what causes these BOP imbalances.
Like an economic detective.
Right.
Putting all those clues together
That too.
to understand a country's financial health.
Now, the last point is remember that the BOP is not just, some abstract concept in a textbook.
Right.
It affects all of us. It has real-world consequences.
Yeah.
And by understanding the BOP, you're going to be better equipped to understand the news,
Yeah.
make smart financial choices,
Right.
and participate in, important discussions about economic policy.
It's about being an informed citizen, really.
Right.
Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the balance of payments. I hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit exciting. Who knows?
The world of economics is always changing, so stay curious, keep exploring, and never stop learning.
And of course, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click that notification bell so you never miss another episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, happy learning.